On a night when the city seemed to hold its breath, Ethan Caldwell was the warmest thing on that stretch of sidewalk. He walked fast against a wind that tried to pry his coat from his shoulders, his breath fogging in quick white bursts, the lights of Caldwell Tower behind him like a promise he no longer trusted. Snow hit the street in silver slats, and the tires of his car hissed through slush as he eased toward his townhouse, rehearsing the next day's talking points in the back of his head. Quarterly margins, compliance, remediation timelines. He had spent his life building sentences that solved problems, building walls that kept him safe. That night, his phone vibrated with the usual litany, an assistance emoji, a brief from legal, a headline draft that had not yet been written. He slid his gloved hand into his pocket, felt the familiar weight of a life arranged in neat compartments, and then he saw her. She was almost invisible against the city, a small shape huddled under the orange glare of a street lamp, a scrap of blanket over a tiny head. Her coat was too thin, knees white with snow. In her arms, an infant bundled in a hospital blanket shivered like a wounded bird. Two shadows, small and brittle, against an enormous, indifferent night. Ethan had the reflex he always had in airports and corporate dinners. Assess distance, move on. Then the child looked up at him. She was 7, maybe 8, face thin, eyes enormous in the way little people's eyes are when they are keeping everything open so no one else has to. The infant's chest rose and fell at a whisper. The little girl's lips trembled as if she were speaking to someone far away. The sound that reached him was so quiet he almost missed it. "Please save my sister," she said. Not a plea for money, not a request for shelter or a crumb of pity. A directive as urgent and precise as the tap of a surgeon's scalpel. The words landed in a place Ethan had long kept tidy and padded. They made his breath stop. He dropped his keys and crossed the street without thinking. The snow ate his footsteps. The cold shocked the fine skin of his face. Up close, the baby's breath was fast and shallow, a small animal's, and the child's hands were blue at the fingertips. Ethan's hands, hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that had smoothed departments over with a line in an email, were suddenly clumsy. He wrapped his coat around the infant, felt the body's weight and the ragged warmth, and lifted. "Hold on," he heard himself say. He did not know whether he was addressing the baby, the little girl, or the fragile idea of himself that stood unused in the world outside his towers. He carried them to his car as if he had always done this. The driveway light threw long shadows. Lily, he would later learn her name, kept her knees tucked, hair wrapped in damp strands against her forehead, a spit of frost on her lashes. She watched him without blinking, the way someone does when they have already decided that there is nothing else to be done, but watch. At the emergency department, the fluorescent lights smelled like bleach and urgency. The triage nurse took one look at the infant and called for help. There were efficient clinical movements, a paper towel, a pulse read, a voice asking a handful of routine questions as if any list could capture what had happened. The word hypothermic passed between doctors in low tones. The infant was pale, barely responding, breathing with a rasp that was all wrong. "Ready for the pediatric critical care team," someone said. "We need consent to intubate if necessary," another voice replied. The questions felt like forms on torn skin. Name, next of kin, who is present. Ethan filled out the emergency guarantor paperwork as if he could invent stability with a signature. He signed his full name, printed his title in a box that seemed obscene. A nurse looked at him with a softness that had nothing to do with his prestige. "You don't have to," she started, then stopped as if the simple fact of his being there rewrote some rule she didn't remember how to state. Lily perched on the vinyl chair, her hands folded around herself, eyes darting between motherless things. She told them in details that sounded practiced and terrible. The apartment by South River, the furnace that stopped one night in November, the neighbor who had knocked once and never again, the mother who had left a note and gone to the river to take care of someone or something, the uncle who sometimes came by and drank and hurt the quiet. She did not cry while she spoke. She conserved that currency for later. The doctors moved around her as they would around any small person who needed facts more than consolation. "Is there anyone else to call?" Maria Torres asked, her voice gentle as a door. She was a social worker on the pediatric floor, neat hair, a badge that said Maria, years of practice in her expression. She wrote things down, the way someone gathers bones for an archaeological dig. Her questions pulled unearthed fragments, assistances, past addresses, the dead mother's name. Maria listened, then folded a paper with a care that made it look like ceremony. "We will make sure Emma is stable first," she said, naming the infant with a careful warmth. "Then we talk about next steps." There was an X-ray image the next hour that no one could yet read as a verdict. The lungs were small and noisy, edges feathered with something the doctors could describe only as consistent with prolonged exposure. Terms that felt, in the sterile light, both precise and inadequate. The pediatrician mentioned the South River in the same sentence that medical supply was ordered. The word landed in the room like a stone. Ethan sat in a plastic chair that mouthed for something more than his attention. He had always treated risk as a spreadsheet. Here, numbers dissolved into the soft shape of someone's infant daughter sucking air. He found himself at the bed's edge while a nurse explained intubation. A tube to help the baby breathe. Sedation to make it bearable. The kind of technical language that keeps the room functional. The doctor said the risks, the probable course, the need for constant monitoring. "We can't promise," the doctor said, which is another way of saying neither yes nor no. There was no reassurance in medicine, only careful, practiced uncertainty. He had money. He used it in ways that were meticulously recorded. Donations, matching grants, charity foundations with glossy pamphlets. But money did not sign consent forms, did not choose to fold itself into a child's sleeping breath. He found himself offering the guarantor's signature in a movement that surprised him, with its speed and decisiveness. He gave his card, his government's identification, the name of his company, each stroke of the pen a small, irrevocable thing. The clerk took the card with polite curiosity, as if complex human emergencies were a new category on a menu. "If anything else comes up," she said, "we can contact you." "Don't, please," Lily said suddenly, looking at Ethan with a gravity beyond her years. "Don't leave." The plea had more in it than need. It was an appeal to responsibility, to presence. Ethan realized that she was not asking for money. She was asking for someone to stay. He stayed. He learned a language that night he had not been asked to know. The beep and hush of monitors, the rhythm of the ward, the way a motherless child's feet curled. He learned the shift patterns of nurses, the way that doctors took turns explaining what might happen next and what might not. He slept in an uncomfortable chair that made no promises of rest and woke to the soft compression of a nurse's hand on the infant's foot. He sat when the meds were adjusted and watched numbers on screens climb and settle. There was no heroism in the vigil, just an unplanned endurance. A photographer from a local paper posted a grainy image of the sidewalk hours later, before the infant had a name. The caption called them 2 children found near South River, and a comment thread bloomed with the mixture of pity, outrage, and cell phone judgment that feeds the internet. A neighbor took a video on their phone. Within 12 hours, someone from a small news outlet called Caldwell Industries seeking comment about the incident. The PR inbox that had been quiet all night vibrated. Ethan's phone buzzed. He let it sit on the small table by his chair a long time before answering. On the other end, his chief counsel's voice was clipped and exact, not unkind, but built to solve complications, to contain liabilities. "We saw a photo," she said. "Are you all right? Are you at the hospital?" He gave a brief title and location, no spin, no pretense. She asked if he had been named or associated with the children. He told her his card had been submitted as an emergency guarantor. "Listen," she said after a pause that sounded like a legal memorandum forming out of thin air. "We should prepare a statement in case the press links this to South River operations. There are ongoing inquiries." Ethan felt an old familiar sensation at the center of a sentence, a boardroom spring to alert. "No statements," he said before he knew why he would speak so bluntly. "Not from me." "Mr. Caldwell," she began. He closed his eyes and saw his mother's kitchen, a small house with a radiator that clinked in winter, a sister with a chipped tooth and a laugh like a bell. He had built an empire on the distance between that kitchen and his marble halls. In a moment of private reckoning, he realized he was choosing between the thing that protected his reputation and the thing that protected a child's breath. "If she needs surgery," he said, "I will ensure it. No press releases, no PR line. We do what is needed." The counsel's voice became practical again, but there was a new note there. Interest, maybe suspicion, maybe a calculation. "If this is tied to South River, then there will be inquiries," she said. "There may be requests for company documents, environmental studies, access to sites. You understand the exposures." He understood in the way an executive understands risk, potential litigation, regulatory scrutiny, shareholder unease. He also felt with a clarity that frightened him, a moral responsibility. The choice he had made at the streetlight was not a charitable transaction. It was a bridge crossing into other people's suffering. He felt for the first time in a long while, like someone indebted without a ledger to balance it. There were small, brutal details that no one lets you forget. The sound of a clear plastic bag being removed from a machine, the way the infant's nostrils flared when nurses suctioned secretions, the way Lily hummed quietly to the baby in a private cadence. Sometimes she slept, clinging to a blanket with damp hair, and Ethan realized she had not yet learned how to be a child when the world demanded it of her. He watched her make tiny rituals, alphabet games in the margins of hospital pamphlets, counting the tiles on the ceiling in a voice that refused to be consumed by fear. Maria Torres sat with him in the small window between rounds, paperwork spread out like a map of obligations. She asked questions with the soft order of someone cataloging who and what needed care. "Do you have any family who can take them?" she asked. "Not that I can find," Lily answered without looking up, as if she had already anticipated the shapes of their future. She said the uncle's name, Rick Dalton, then added, "He drinks." He left. Maria wrote the name down. That night, the pediatric pulmonologist raised a possibility that felt like a door opening in a brick wall. Long-term exposure to particles commonly found where rivers like South River flood or receive industrial runoff can manifest as chronic respiratory problems in small children. It was not a clean causal line. Medicine rarely operates in one-to-one equations. But in a clinical, cautious voice, the doctor said there had been cases, clusters along certain areas, where respiratory rates and difficulties were elevated. "We often recommend an environmental assessment," she said, "and social supports. These kids are not just medically fragile, they're living in fragile conditions." On his phone, in the quiet of the chairs, Ethan scrolled through a map until the South River glittered unfamiliar and close. Caldwell Industries had plants on 2 stretches of that river's bank, he knew from briefings and board tours. The name was small on the interface, a pixel of geography, South River. The words in the doctor's mouth condensed into a new metric for him, corporate footprint. Overnight, the sterile terms of his work, permitted discharge, sediment testing, compliance reports, felt suddenly urgent in a different register. They felt centered on a baby's breath. In the early hours, a reporter found a nurse who mentioned a donor. The outlet printed a brief item. Unidentified executive steps up to fund care for South River children. It was thin and breathless, like gossip. It was not a headline that would have been news if it were about any other millionaire making a calculated donation. But the internet is a small, amplifying room. The piece traveled. Ethan heard the rumors before he saw the headlines. He had breakfast delivered to the small hospital cafeteria, burnt coffee, a bagel with a smear of cream cheese that he barely tasted, and his assistant texted a screenshot of a trending tweet. Men in suits had already begun to coordinate messages. "Containment," someone texted him. "Legal will want..." He shoved his phone into his pocket. He had not come for headlines. He had not signed up for disavowals and damage control. He had come because a small voice ordered him to. That simple, childlike imperative had unsettled him in a way that money never had. He could see the ledger toppling if he let his office do the thinking. Perhaps that was precisely why he had to act on something other than the ledger. Lily and he kept a rhythm in the ward that had nothing to do with efficiency. Small jokes that felt like contraband, the sharing of a single small orange between them, the way they took turns reading a tattered fairy tale in a halting cadence. He learned the contours of lullabies from the way she hummed them. He learned to tie a tiny pink bow, a domestic skill he had never considered in his life of tailored suits, on a blanket. These were not staged acts for any camera. They were the slow, unglamorous work of being present. When the first social media mention expanded into a local news piece implying connection to Caldwell Industries, a member of Ethan's board texted, "Do you want me to call the council?" There was the expectation that he would retreat into his suit and statements, that he would issue an apology crafted for minimal liability. He could picture the corporate lawyer in crisp shoes advising the neatest, least damaging language. Instead, Ethan walked the corridor alone and called his chief counsel again. When she asked whether he wanted the company to preemptively release an environmental report, he said, "No, not a report. I want to go to South River." There was a pause on the line as if someone had set a chessboard down and then walked away. "Do you want to visit the community with a press team?" she asked, measuring a safe escape hatch. "No press," he said. He felt clumsy and unsure, like a man trying on a new skin. "I want to see it for myself. Quiet, with Maria's support, and then we'll decide what the company should do." "You understand the optics," she said. "I understand the smell of hospital disinfectant," he said, looking at little Emma's pinched face behind the glass. "I understand that we don't get to be neat when the work isn't neat." The statement was small, and perhaps naive. His counsel's voice suggested a gentler route. "If you insist, I will put a team together. Counsel should be present." "Not as a shield," he said, "as a record." The next day, a man in a rumpled coat appeared at the hospital reception. He had a thick, unkempt beard and a smell. Booze and underheated rooms. He said his name loud enough for anyone to hear. Rick Dalton. His eyes sought the child, landed on Lily, and then on Ethan. There was a flash of recognition, an animal flash. He did not understand the rules of small talk or why bright lights in the hospital made him squint. He demanded to see them. His voice rose and dropped like something attached to a weather pattern. "She's my sister," he said, and the claim in his mouth was both blunt and dangerous. "I want my niece." The nurse at the desk placed a phone to her ear and said, "Sir, you need to calm down. We will call the social worker." Rick's shoulders tightened. He lunged for a wallet, for papers. His hands trembled. Lily looked at him with an old sense of horror, as if seeing a storm reappear after a quiet period. Maria came quickly, like someone who had rehearsed this scene in 1,000 variations and still never welcomed it. She moved between Rick and the children with the cautious authority of someone who had seen men fracture under the weight of needing to be someone they once were. "Mr. Dalton," she said quietly, "we'll talk in the office. Right now, the priority is the children's safety." He protested, at first softly. This was his family, the words drooling out of him with pain, and then louder, aligning and misaligning with legal forms he could not afford to parse. He accused anyone who would listen, the city, the landlord, some phantom injustice. He demanded custody as if the hospital were a courthouse of a different kind. Ethan watched him with a new, keen attention. He felt anger rise in a way that was not only paternal, but structural. Anger at a system that let men rot in alleys, and then present themselves as protectors when it suited them. He also felt fear. The legal system did not move quickly for people like Lily, and ex-drinkers with family claims had a habit of destabilizing fragile arrangements. Maria's voice was efficient. "We'll follow protocol," she said. "We will file for temporary custody determinations if necessary. We will call CPS if appropriate. We will not release the children to anyone without verification." It read like a line from a manual, but there was a tenderness in it. She turned to Lily, who had wrapped her arms around the infant, small forehead pressed to the baby's scalp. "Are you safe here?" Maria asked. "I'm fine," Lily said. Her voice had a brittle steadiness that both concealed and revealed how much had already been taken from her. She needs to stay. Please. Rick swore under his breath. He looked at Ethan with a look that was not merely accusation but a plea for salvation. You rich folks, he said, a slur of blame sharpened by drink. You step in and step out. Don't think you can buy us. This is family. Ethan could have walked away. He could have retreated to legal memos that would have measured out the cost of temporary guardianship, the PR fallout, the exposure of Caldwell Industries' South River files. He knew the strategies that would be offered to him. Distance, denials, controlled statements. But the baby in the bassinet breathed with the slow determination of something not yet broken. The girl at the chair looked at him as if he were a potential axis on which something could turn. The moral logic of the moment was not complex. Choose privacy or presence. When he spoke, it was without ceremony. I'm not stepping in to save my reputation, he said. I'm stepping in because this child needs help now. The words were small and inadequate, and then, in the way life sometimes surprises itself, they were everything the room needed to begin rearranging. People took them at face value, or at least at working value. A social worker began the forms for a temporary caregiver designation, a practical bridge, while legal channels sorted themselves. A nurse adjusted an IV. Rick's fists curled and uncurled as if reasoning with himself. There was even then a part of the hospital that smelled like business. Clipboards, stamped forms, official folds. But there was also a part that smelled like bad coffee and the hushed lullaby of monitors when a hush of peace falls. Ethan found himself in a place he rarely had to occupy, accountable not for the quarterly report, but for a small human life. Outside, in the sliver of morning between black sky and the city's hush, a headline on a regional paper flashed, CEO steps up for South River infant. Comments churned with the usual mixture of suspicion and gratitude. Someone called it a PR move, someone else called it a miracle. Neither label fit the messy fact. A man with a fortune in the bank sitting in a plastic chair watching a baby breathe. That afternoon, in a small, overheated office smelling of copier toner and disinfectant, Maria and Ethan would talk about the paper trail. She unfolded a file stamped with old eviction notices, a death certificate, the kind of bureaucratic paper that names the ghosts who haunt neighborhoods. She showed him the mother's file, a woman named Rosa, listed as deceased. Cause of death, a small clinical phrase that did not carry with it the tilt and ache of a mother's absence. The child's birth certificate, an odd child's dented name on a paper that lived in a drawer until someone needed it. South River has been in touch with environmental regulators before, Maria said. There were community complaints about sediment and a smell that some residents reported. It wasn't pinned to a single source, and sometimes complaints get lost between agencies. Families like Rosa's get the worst of the back and forth. Ethan listened to the paper shuffling. He pictured maps, charts, PowerPoint slides, a sanitized geography that had never had to look a child in the eye. The idea that his company might be part of a problem that showed itself in a baby's struggling lungs cut through his life like a sharp wind. It undermined the neat power of corporate rationalization. It made the work he had delegated to committees suddenly personal. That night, as he left the hospital to sleep in a nearby hotel room, there was a new sensation in him that was closer to dread than to courage, the recognition that doing the right thing could cost him in ways he had never cost himself. He might have to answer to shareholders for environmental remediation, to regulators for past permits, to communities for a pattern of neglect. He might have to expose documents that would make headlines and draw scrutiny. He might lose in a way he had never risked losing before, the tidy moral economy of his life. But he was already entangled. The pen stroke on the guarantor form, the empty chair in the ward, the child's small hand tucked into a blanket. These were commitments not easily undone by crisis managers. He had taken a first step, and the possible consequences folded out before him like a map. He slept badly. Dreams clogged with water and riverbanks and a woman he did not know, but whose absence seemed to echo within him. At dawn he walked back into the pediatric unit with coffee cooled in his hands, and a new resolve that was, at first, only a willingness. He found Lily awake and humming in a low voice. rocking the baby in a rhythm that had nothing to do with charts. "Thank you," Lily said when she noticed him, as if gratitude were the only currency left in the room. "You don't have to thank me," he said. He felt clumsy, the man the world applauded for his decisiveness suddenly at risk of being clumsy like everyone else. "Just tell me if you need something." Lily's eyes flicked to Emma, who lay small and taut in the hospital bassinet. "Don't let him take her," she whispered. "Who?" Ethan asked. Rick Dalton's name floated like a storm cloud that could not be wished away. The man was not yet a legal figure in their lives, but he stood at the threshold of that possibility, a present danger that could upend the fragile sanctuary of the ward. Ethan felt the boardroom instincts kick in, assess leverage, build a case, document every claim. But this was not a table that organized itself with contracts. It would be harder, messier. It would require time, presence, and sacrifice. "He's family," Lily said, the word sick with memory. "But sometimes family takes the wrong things." Ethan nodded. In that small exchange, the city and the river and the offices and the hospital seemed to conspire to make a simple moral demand. Be present. The rest, lawsuits, tests, environmental cleanups, were work that could be scheduled, delegated, resolved in forms. Presence could not be scheduled. It had to be lived. "If this kind of story moves you, stay with me. This choice makes everything larger than a rescue," the narrator might have said then, and in truth it did. He would see the consequences unfold, would watch the press swirl, the lawyers entangle, the community meetings begin. He would learn to answer questions that had no neat corporate response. But that night, as hospital lights hummed and the city kept its cold vigil, the most urgent demand remained small and simple. Keep the baby breathing, keep the child safe. And across from the infant, a millionaire CEO who had spent his life buying solutions, sat with hands he had not used in care, and felt the fracturing of a life that had known only transactions. He felt, for the first time, the rawness of obligation. Outside, South River moved in the dark like a wound. Inside, the infant's chest rose and fell, and Lily slept for an hour with her face soft against the blanket. The pieces had been set in motion, an emergency guarantor signature, a tentative link to environmental exposure, a needy uncle at the door, and no one in the hospital could yet see how tight the threads would bind. The world, for the moment, was reduced to beeps and soft footsteps, and the small, stubborn work of keeping someone alive. Ethan called Maria before the morning rounds. "I want to know everything you find," he said. "Not from counsel, direct. Tell me what the neighbors say, what the city files show, what those reports say." "That's a lot to ask," she said, but the answer in her voice held a professional warmth that suggested she understood the difference between someone writing a check and someone choosing to stand. "I know," he said, "but I'm not here to write a check." She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a small, incredulous exhale. "We can start with the mother's file, and then the landlord's records. I'll pull community complaints going back 5 years. We'll talk to public health." "Do it quietly," he added. "No press." "Always quietly at first," Maria said. "People need time to feel safe when cameras come." Rick Dalton's shadow had not yet left the hospital. In his own small apartments and alleys, his muscles tightened in response to a claim he had always thought his by right. That kind of man does not disappear because a billionaire sits in a chair. If anything, he intensifies. The legal system will have its arc, the media will want spectacle. The company's files will create their own storm. But between those mechanisms, the legal remedies, the press cycles, the corporate committees, there was a human center. It was messy and slow and morally complicated. Ethan sat by the window and watched the river's flat black surface in the distance. He pictured the plant's gate at South River, the trucks that carried things across bridges, the study in a file drawer somewhere that might, in a neat paragraph, absolve one actor and implicate another. He had not chosen to be a hero. He had simply been human enough in a moment to move. The act itself had cost him little then, and promised to cost him a great deal later. When Lily woke again, she tugged at his sleeve and held up a crumpled drawing. 2 figures under a night sky, one much bigger than the other, both holding a hand over a small oval shape. "Is that us?" she asked. "Yes," Ethan said, and the lie, if it was a lie, felt like the truest thing he had spoken in years. He had not yet become the man who could promise a home or a future. He had not yet cleared the legal hurdles or set remediation timelines. But he had stayed. He had kept his hand warm around a child's small, trembling life, and in that intended act, something had shifted. There is a peculiar gravity in choosing to stand when escape looks easier. The choice does not end suffering. It complicates it, entangles it in responsibility. Ethan would be tested on every front: his company, his family, his comfort. He would have to reconcile the neat architectures of his business with the ragged realities of the riverbank. He had opened a door, and the wind that came through it carried mud and history, and the smell of things left undone. Outside, someone in a cheap jacket filmed Rick pacing by the hospital steps. He muttered into a phone, and a clip of his voice, staggered, indignant, found its way onto a local feed. The thread of the story widened. Infant in critical condition. Generous benefactor. Suspected link to industrial runoff. Unstable relative claiming custody. The ingredients for a scandal lined up like notes in a chord. Ethan read the alerts and felt something like nausea, but steadier. Commitment. He had the resources to send teams, to commission studies, to fund care that would keep Emma alive regardless of what the headlines demanded. But money cannot grant the human thing Lily asked for that first night: consistent presence. That had required a person, not a check. He had offered that personhood, and found the work of being human both heavier and truer than he expected. By noon, a regional environmental advocacy group sent an email requesting comment about the children found near South River. Their language was measured, their concern predictable. "We have been tracking water quality in these neighborhoods for years," the message read. They asked if Caldwell Industries planned to release any recent environmental monitoring data. Ethan paused, his thumb on the send key. The options stretched before him like roads on a satellite map. Release data, prepare legal defenses, or step into the uncomfortable work of accountability. He thought of Lily's voice. "Please, save my sister." That voice had been the inciting incident, but it was not the whole story. The whole story asked of him more than money. It asked for acknowledgement, for remediation, for a willingness to risk reputation and margin for the sake of a human cost that happened on a map he could no longer pretend was only a spreadsheet. He hit reply and typed 3 simple words: "We will cooperate." Then he deleted them and wrote instead a note that read, "We will fund the infant's care immediately and will support a community-led environmental review. No press releases from us until families are consulted." He sat with the sentence a long time and thought about how it would land. It would anger the lawyers. It would unsettle the board. It would not be easy. But he saved and sent it to Maria to forward. That afternoon, the hospital's pediatric team left the infant sedated and safe under the careful watch of nurses, while a social worker met with Rick Dalton in a small sterile room. The man alternated between bluster and pleading. He had some rights that would have to be validated in court. He had a history that could be documented. He said his part aloud, weaving facts and miseries into a narrative that might carry the weight of his claim. On the other side of the glass, Ethan watched the conversation through the slight sheen of the window, and felt the engines of the justice system slowly begin to turn. The legal questions were not yet full-blown in the way the press would make them later. They were, at first, procedural. Who had the authority to make decisions? Who would be responsible for the child's care if the mother was deceased and no clear guardian existed? Social services would draft petitions. A judge might be asked to issue temporary orders. Each movement would be slow and scrupulous. Each step in a process could be exploited, manipulated, or used by people with motives that did not match the child's needs. Ethan thought of words his father used to say in a voice that was never cruel, but rarely warm. "Do what is necessary." For most of his life, that had meant achieving targets by any lawful means. That night, necessary had a new, quieter definition. Sit up all night, learn how to swaddle, sign forms, Let someone see you when you feel brittle. When Lily clambered onto the small recliner later that evening and pressed her forehead to his, she said, "Will you stay, like, here, with us?" He did not pretend to know the future, and he did not make promises he could not keep. But he also saw now the emptiness of the old life, the life measured by margins and quarterly reports, and the satisfaction of neat endings. He had been shaken awake. If staying meant that he would have to alter more than his schedule, if it meant he would open the company books and the gates to the river's edge, if it meant he'd give up carefully maintained distance, then he could feel, for the first time in years, the small joy of a thing done because it was right. "Yes," he told her, "for now, I'm not going anywhere tonight." Lily's small hand fit into his the way a key fits a lock. Final, sure. The hospital hummed and the city sighed. Somewhere, South River moved on in its dark, and somewhere in an office stacked with compliance reports men planned for contingencies they had not yet imagined. The first act of this debris, the rescue, the signature, the bedside vigil, had been committed. There would be hearings, and there would be questions that arrived in neat stacks and demanded careful answers. There would be nights when Ethan lay awake calculating risk like he always had. Loss of stock value, the weight of subpoenas, the tone-deaf memos of well-meaning executives. And there would also be mornings when the small, insistent sound of Emma's breathing drowned those calculations out. The first real legal movement came as a flurry of orders and polite forms. Maria handed Ethan a folder with court dates circled in ink that looked too human for the hospital's sterile light. "We'll file for temporary guardianship while the courts sort it out," she said, setting the papers down as if laying tiles. Her voice did not tremble. She had seen this pattern enough to know where the brittle parts were. There would be a temporary placement hearing, she explained, and a judge would decide what was immediately in the children's best interest. Rick Dalton retained an overworked public defender, a man with late-night cigarette breath and a stack of files. He came to the hearing in a jacket that smelled faintly of something that was not water, and his eyes darted as if he expected the floor to open beneath him. He spoke loudly when his turn came, half anger, half supplication. "They're my family," he said. "I grew up with them. She belongs with me." That claim, sincere in its raw way, met the scrupulous machinery of social work and law. Records were pulled. Neighbors spoke in short, protective sentences. Maria testified to the pattern she'd found in the files. Eviction notices, missed welfare appointments, a landlord who had been trying to locate the children's next of kin. The court had to weigh a father's claim against documented neglect and the child's immediate safety. It was the cold arithmetic of best interests, and yet it felt painfully human. When Ethan took the stand, the room shifted. He was not the first wealthy man to testify in a custody dispute, but the angle was not what anyone expected. His counsel had prepared him for questions about intent, conflict of interest, and liability. The press had imagined speeches rehearsed in the manner of glossy apology. He had rehearsed legal phrases until they tasted like hollow coin. But the question that landed in him in the bright, formal courthouse was smaller and more dangerous. The judge looked at him across the bench, the kind of person whose life had been built on procedure, and whose gaze could make half-truths feel thin. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, voice even, "why are you seeking temporary guardianship?" Ethan felt the room narrow to the size of Lily's small hand in his. He saw the hospital sheets, the monitor's soft blue, the way Lily hummed to Emma. He felt the weight of the week in the edges of his suit. He could have given the rehearsed answer, to ensure immediate medical care, to provide financial support while social services completed their review. Those answers would have been true, and, in their truth, also evasive. "I am here because 2 children needed someone to make decisions for them now," he said. His voice was steady, not theatrical. "Because the woman who should have been there is not, and because the man who claims kinship may not be in a position to keep them safe. I am stepping forward to be here, to be accountable for their care, and to make sure, first, that Emma receives the medical attention she needs." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Ethan had not scripted the next sentence. He did not intend it to be a confession so much as an acknowledgement. And I will also say this, he continued, surprising himself with the bluntness of it. If my company bears any responsibility for conditions in the South River community that contributed to these children's hardships, I will ensure we are part of the solution. I will not hide from that. It was the line that made people in the room look up from their papers. For his counsel, it was a gasp. Legal landmines unfolded beneath that admission. For the judge, it was new information that would have to be cataloged and tested. For Rick, it was a line of accusation made visible in a public way. An elder who could not imagine corporate responsibility being anything other than a statement of lawyers. For the community members in the gallery, it felt like a small, seismic event. The press, which had been hungrily waiting for a glossy apology, now had something more complex. A wealthy man accepting both familial duty and corporate accountability in the same breath. That acceptance was not cheap. Within days, his phone rang with calls from board members, whose voices started polite and then turned brittle. There were shareholder emails that arrived at all hours, demanding explanations, projections of financial impact, requests for immediate disclosures. There was, inevitably, a faction that saw his admission as career suicide, and another that saw it as calculated theater. The company's legal team moved into high gear. They drafted memos with the speed and dryness of a laboratory, weighing precedent and exposure. Some directors urged restraint, counsel urged caution. One of his oldest allies suggested he take a leave of absence until the legal dust settled. Ethan considered all of it, and then took a step that shocked more than the public declaration. He asked the board for an official leave of absence from the day-to-day operations of Caldwell Industries. It was a symbolic gesture and a legal maneuver both. He would not abandon his company, but he would cede operational control to his COO, while he focused on the children and the unfolding environmental inquiries. The board, furious and relieved in turns, agreed after hours of fractious argument. Share prices dipped the afternoon the news broke. Columnists parsed motives for weeks. The courtroom awarded temporary guardianship to Ethan. The judge cited the immediate stability he provided, his willingness to cover medical expenses, and the absence of a reliable, sober relative at hand. The order was provisional. Social services would continue their investigations, and the court would revisit custody at scheduled intervals. Rick's efforts to secure custody were frustrated not through judgment alone, but through the grim clarity of documentation. His uneven employment record, his untreated substance use, the testimony of neighbors who had seen violence and neglect. The court's decision did not strip him of his humanity or his legal rights, but it placed the children's immediate welfare above his claims. For Ethan, the decision was both relief and a new boundary. To the public, it looked like a rich man taking responsibility. To him, it was an obligation that arrived wrapped in 1,000 small tasks, appointments, court filings, school enrollment forms he had never imagined filling out. It was a life measured not in profit margins, but in the exact time it took to rock a child to sleep without waking the other. Hospital days blurred into a calendar of outpatient visits, therapies, and cautious improvements. Emma's lungs, fragile and slow to respond, improved on a scale of inches rather than leaps. There were nights the monitors would spike and the fear would surge fresh and raw. There were also mornings when her breathing eased, small bluffs of progress that felt miraculous only because they were incremental. The medical team never promised certainty. They spoke in guarded hope and pragmatic next steps. Ethan sat through them all. A new kind of person in the sterile chairs. Someone who absorbed bad news and then chose a next thing. He learned how to coordinate medications, how to advocate firmly without drowning in paternalism, how to read a chart with enough literacy to ask the right questions. Lily grew steady into a presence that rearranged Ethan's house and his heart. She learned whose job was where, in his new overfull life. She took charge of small domestic rituals with a fierce pride. She set Emma's rattles in a neat row. She decided which book would be read at bedtime. And she taught Ethan the right volume and cadence for Goodnight Moon. As if that were a second language worth learning. Ethan found himself in a kitchen he had never used. He burned toast and learned to make tea the way Emma liked it warmed. He turned his large formal townhouse into a place with a high chair, a shelf of picture books, soft blankets, and mismatched socks. The transformation was messy and quiet. He sometimes felt ridiculous fumbling with a pacifier, but increasingly satisfied by the ordinary competence of the act. Social services oversight meant the family's life became a pattern of home visits and reviews. A caseworker would come with forms and checklists and ask the sort of questions that tested whether a stranger's life could provide a child's stability. Maria remained a steady presence, coordinating records and input, a bridge between the institutional world and the messy human one. She visited the townhouse more than once, noting the baby locks on cabinets and the careful arrangement of Emma's medications. "You're doing a lot of things right," she told Ethan in a moment of rare private praise. "But don't assume the courts will decide this overnight. Family law moves slowly." He accepted that slowness as part of the work. The company's PR had pivoted. There were statements about cooperation and funding for remediation. Ethan funded immediate care costs and set up a trust for Emma and Lily's education. He signed agreements for independent environmental assessments along South River, paid for anonymously at first. Then, when the community demanded transparency, publicly. The independent study found elevated levels of certain residues in places where runoff pooled and where families had built informal access points to water. The report did not, of itself, finger Caldwell Industries as sole culprit. Industrial histories overlap. Multiple facilities sat nearby. Municipal infrastructure had its own failures. But it did show patterns consistent with community complaints. Ethan's public acceptance of responsibility, in court on record, forced his company to the table. Caldwell Industries could no longer treat environmental compliance as a set of line items. The board appointed a remediation committee and, through days of tense negotiation with local leaders, agreed to fund a phased cleanup plan, increased monitoring, and a community health fund. There were legal consequences. Regulatory inquiries, a few fines that were part chastisement and part public accounting, and the hum of lawyers cross-referencing permits. Those costs were real. Ethan signed off on them with his signature feeling heavier than it ever had on a share buyback plan. He also accepted other costs that had nothing to do with balance sheets. There were friends who drifted away. There were medians of gossip about motive and PR stunts. He slept less. He missed dinners he had once deemed mandatory. There were, too, moments of unexpected connection. Neighbors from the South River neighborhood, who came to the townhouse with casseroles and stories, and an older woman who had once protested outside a plant gate who now brought Lily homemade dolls, and the memory of a river when it had been clearer. There was a local pastor who would sometimes drop by and offer a quiet presence. The social network that formed around the children made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a house with a future. Rick Dalton did not disappear into defeat. He kept to the edges, sometimes calling late at night in a voice pitched between remorse and demand. He showed up at hearings with new advocates, and at one point attempted to petition for supervised visitation. Social work coordinated a plan that allowed him to see the children under monitored conditions if he entered a treatment program. The court laid out steps, proof of sustained sobriety, participation in parenting classes, stable housing. Rick agreed and promised, sometimes with sincerity and sometimes with a swagger that turned to shame under scrutiny. There were relapses. There were also days where he biked to the Little League field and came home exhausted, claiming small victories. Ethan never chose to cut him out completely. He wanted, in a utilitarian human way, to make space for reclamation if reclamation could be honest and verifiable. That stance cost him empathy from some who wanted the line drawn sharp. But it also allowed for a possibility that accountability could mean both protection for the children and a path for someone else to rebuild. Months folded. Emma's breathing stabilized to a rhythm that allowed more playful crying and fewer spikes of fear. She graduated from round-the-clock monitoring to scheduled visits. Doctors adjusted medications and prescribed respiratory therapy that slowly increased her lung capacity. None of the improvements were dramatic in the way of overnight miracles. They were measured, careful, often imperceptible if you weren't watching closely. For Ethan, Watching a slight increase in oxygen saturation felt like watching the tip of a promised future arrive. He learned patience the way one learns to wait for plants to root, by tending, not magic. Lily changed around these small victories. The defiant set of her jaw softened in private moments, when she allowed herself to be a child, biting down on crustless sandwiches, learning to ride a small bike in the townhouse alley under Ethan's unsteady coaching, laughing with the careless abandon of someone who had been given permission to belong. She also found an ember of purpose in the story that had upended her life. School put her in a fourth-grade class that had a social studies unit on local geography. Lily, who had experienced the river as danger, decided it could also be the subject of a science project. Her project started small, measuring a local stream's cleanliness with strips of paper she was too young to read decisively, but old enough to want answers. Ethan and Maria connected her with a community organizer who showed her how to collect water samples, how to ask simple, respectful questions in public meetings, and how to write a short report. The community responded. Neighbors came to a meeting with photographs. An older man brought maps he'd saved from when he worked on docks. A high school teacher offered to mentor Lily's after-school group. The town's municipal engineer, surprisingly, attended one of their early meetings and explained how stormwater flowed into the South River and how old sewer pipes sometimes overflowed into places they were not supposed to reach. The kids learned how complex a place could be, how many people and systems made a single problem show up in a child's chest. There were community meetings with heated moments. Some residents distrustful of Caldwell Industries wanted complete corporate disclosure and immediate action. Others feared that demands would simply invite corporate retreat and legal posturing. Ethan listened, sometimes receiving anger with a steadiness that surprised even him. He did not offer polished sound bites. He offered plans and budgets and an open calendar for public input. He sat through angry town halls where his name was shouted and where he accepted both blame and counsel. The act of sitting in those rooms, of letting people tell their stories, shifted something about the tenor of consequence. It also made the company's technical teams work faster under public scrutiny. Remediation plans were drafted with community input. Independent monitors were assigned to oversee the work. Those projects produced labor-intensive results: removal of contaminated sediment in small stretches, installation of better stormwater controls, community workshops teaching residents how to filter and store water safely in the short term, and job training programs for locals to be part of the cleanup workforce. Caldwell Industries funded scholarships for young workers and set up a community advisory board that included residents, public health officials, and environmental scientists. It was not a panacea. The river remained compromised in parts, and the work would continue for years. But it was tangible action that began to shift the narrative from accusation to remediation. Inside Ethan's house, daily life continued with its small intimacies. He learned the rhythm of Emma's sleep, the recipes for bland foods that soothed little stomachs, how to disinfect a fevered forehead correctly, and the right sort of restraint to hold a child while a nurse administered a vaccine. He learned to read the way Emma's skin flushed before a coughing spell, and to time his actions to ease it. He learned to make calls from the dairy aisle of the grocery store when a medication was unavailable. He learned the sound of Lily's voice when she was proud and when she was afraid. There were quieter moments that rewired him more than any public admission. On a rain-wet Saturday, he found Lily in the back garden, digging in a patch of their small yard with a plastic shovel given by a neighbor. She had planted a row of marigolds in a patch of recycled soil, crowning them with old bottle caps to mark each seed. "They help bugs," she said when he watched. "They keep bad things away from the roots." Ethan sat down beside her with his hands in the dirt and felt the coarse first wet smell of earth seep under his fingernails. It was one of those small domestic rituals that rearranged him. This gardening, this patient tending. He felt a strange, steadyful joy that had nothing to do with headlines. There were also the administrative tethers that kept his life in the dimension it had left. Corporate meetings required his input. Regulators asked for documents. Attorneys requested depositions. He learned to compartmentalize without retreating. He accepted that some days would be hospital wards and some would be boardrooms, and that both demanded moral courage of different sorts. The hardship was wearing, but it was also the place where he began to recognize a truer metric for his leadership, how well he could stand in paradox and act in accountable ways without retreating to prepared statements. Time lent an odd sort of healing. Emma, though still carefully monitored, grew fuller-faced and more robust. She laughed, a small sound that felt like currency, and the first time she tried to crawl, Lily cheered as if she had won a prize. The court revisited custody, and months of oversight, treatment, and documented care tilted the scales. Rick persisted in his claim and, in rare moments of lucidity, expressed sorrow and some willingness to endure the work required to prove himself. The judge, in an interim hearing, extended the temporary guardianship while acknowledging that Rick would be given opportunities to rehabilitate and pursue supervised contact. An eventual permanent arrangement would depend on the children's needs and the results of recommended interventions. The dynamics were messy and often painful. Parenthood exposed Ethan's private fears in ways the boardroom never had. His impatience, his tendency to default to command instead of care, his inclination to solve with money instead of presence. He failed small tests, snapping when Emma fussed through the night, getting frustrated with a bureaucratic form, and then learned to apologize to a 7-year-old for losing his temper. He learned how to admit ignorance, to ask for help, to be coached on how to read social cues of a child who had learned to prioritize survival over play. He discovered humility in tasks as ordinary as changing diapers, and as strange as singing lullabies in a voice that had once only been used for annual charity galas. Lily, for her part, developed a steady courage. She debated loudly in school about what communities could do to protect children from pollutants. Her teacher, noticing a curiosity that had become a steady interest, encouraged her to enter a small regional science fair. Lily, with Ethan's hesitant help and the support of community mentors, prepared a simple model demonstrating how waste from industries could leach into river systems, an honest visual piece that required no grand claims, only clarity and an invitation to think about systems. At the fair, the judges were moved not by spectacle but by Lily's presentation. Careful notes, a simple chart, photographs of the South River she had collected with a borrowed camera. She won a small prize, the kind with a ribbon and a certificate. But the real prize was the attention it drew to the neighborhood, and to the small human face of the story that had started with her plea on a snow-sifted sidewalk. A local environmental nonprofit, impressed by Lily's clarity, offered to sponsor her attendance at a youth leadership camp. Ethan, who felt a proprietorship of sorts over every new opportunity offered to her, said yes without deliberation. The memorial for Rosa, the children's mother, happened on a late autumn morning when the town felt sharp and small. Lily had asked for it. "We need to tell her she was loved," she said simply, having learned to direct rituals with a precision beyond her years. Ethan agreed. They went together to a small cemetery on a hill that watched over the river. The sky was a hard, clean blue, and the grass crunched underfoot. Maria accompanied them, as did a few neighbors and the pastor who had sometimes dropped muffins by the townhouse. At the grave, Ethan spoke in a voice he did not quite recognize, unsteady and true. He admitted failure in the polite corporate sense, and then committed to something more exact, presence and stewardship. He read a note Lily had written, simple, childlike. "Thank you for sending the man who stayed." The words hit a place inside him that had always been insulated and found a tear there. For the first time since old family losses, he allowed himself to grieve aloud for what had been missing in his own childhood, hands that steadied and stayed. "It won't fix everything," he said quietly into the air as if the words might reach through earth and water. "But we'll keep working. We'll try to make sure the river isn't stealing any more breaths." They laid small stones. Lily insisted on the headstone, one for each thing they'd promised, and then stood in a brief silence. The ritual held a quiet dignity. It did not solve systemic injustice, nor did it mend all the fractures in their lives. But it marked a step toward repair, toward a future in which promises might be kept with the same stubborn regularity as the river's flow. Years did not erase the past, but receded like a shoreline that becomes less immediate as a community works its edges. Caldwell Industries expanded its remediation commitments and created a long-term community health fund run by a board that included residents. The company funded a small clinic by the river for respiratory care and free screenings. They removed a few hazards that had been immediate contributors to water contamination. They replaced old storage that had leaked into urban runoff. The results were slow and sometimes contested. Studies contradicted each other. Protesters demanded faster action. But tangible improvements appeared in small metrics: fewer emergency room visits for certain respiratory crises in targeted zones, improved fish counts in pilot stretches, new playgrounds where old culverts had been cleaned. Public perception shifted in uneven waves. Some still accused Ethan of a PR play. Others quietly thanked him at the community center. He learned to accept that redemption is never clean. He also learned that accountability looks like long hours of bureaucratic follow-through and a willingness to be present in small, unglamorous ways. When a local father hugged him at a health clinic and said, "You didn't have to do this," Ethan could not say the word that had become the hinge of his new life. "Yes, I did," without feeling the truth of it. Lily, now older by a few years and beginning to carry herself with teenage ease, addressed a small civic gathering on a damp spring morning. She spoke about the river not as a villain but as a neighbor that had been mistreated. She called for local curriculum changes to include civic ecology, and for more young people to take part in monitoring projects. The audience was small, the podium borrowed, the microphone slightly squeaky. She spoke with a clarity and confidence that made some in the room open their mouths in surprise. Ethan watched from the second row, chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with business. "You saved my sister," Lily said later that day, ever precise in the distribution of credit. "But I think you saved a lot of other things too, even things inside you." He had no neat reply for such generosity. He smiled, which was sometimes all he could do. At work, Caldwell Industries instituted new policies: tighter oversight on effluent, community representatives on environmental review panels, and a transparency portal where residents could track remediation progress. The company also funded scholarships for youth from South River to study environmental science and engineering. Ethan attended community advisory meetings not as a figurehead, but as someone who listened to the technical details and carried them back to the executive suite. He understood that his public acceptance of responsibility came with a cost: the need to translate moral admission into corporate action, and to do so in ways that could survive legal scrutiny and public impatience. There were moments of friction. Attorneys asked for delays. Stock analysts published cautious notes. Some employees felt ashamed or bewildered. But the company's new direction also attracted engineers committed to remedial innovation and employees who wanted their work to mean more. It was not a triumphal arc so much as a realignment of priorities that left no one untouched. Years later, at a small civic fair celebrating local efforts, Lily stood at a modest stage and accepted a youth environmental prize for a project that mapped small waterways and proposed neighborhood-level interventions. The crowd was a patchwork of faces she'd come to know. Neighbors, an old woman with the homemade dolls, a municipal engineer, the pastor Maria, and staff from the nonprofit that had mentored her. Ethan sat near the back, wearing a sweater he no longer found alien. He had become adept at being in the world without omnipotence, at listening to young voices that knew things adults had failed to learn. After the ceremony, someone took a photo, a simple, grainy image of a girl with a ribbon and a man whose face had aged into a gentleness he had not known before. The picture circulated around the small community and, predictably, made its way into regional news feeds. People argued about motive long after the photograph existed. But the occasional photograph does not contain the long-bodied truth of a life lived differently. It only hints at the subtle, steady work that had been done. When the judge finally considered a petition to move toward more permanent arrangements, the court reviewed months of documentation: records of medical care, social work reports indicating progress, Rick's efforts and continued struggles, and the children's own wishes, which courts increasingly consider. In a careful, non-heroic decision that honored process, The court extended guardianship to Ethan with a long-term plan that required continued social services oversight, structured visitation for Rick contingent on treatment milestones, and a clear path for eventual legal permanency that prioritized the children's stability and wishes. It was not a tidy, dramatic reassignment. It was, rather, a sober recognition that a wealthy man had stepped into an obligation and had seen that obligation through in ways that were costly to his personal life and his corporate standing. The shock the public felt at the outset, that a CEO would accept such cost, had rippled into deeper work, repair efforts at the river, a family stitched imperfectly into a new shape, and a man whose moral compass had shifted through daily, small acts. Ethan kept some of his public life. He did not fade into obscurity. He continued to attend board meetings. He occasionally spoke at industry forums about environmental accountability. But the center of his life no longer aligned with the marble halls alone. Dinner tables and bedtime rituals took precedence where quarterlies once did. He learned to measure success in terms not only of market share, but of children's breathing. There were, of course, days when the future felt uncertain. Emma had episodes, coughs that returned like winter. There were funding shortfalls in remediation projects and bureaucratic delays. There were board members who never forgave his risk and journalists who questioned motives. But there were also more days of laughter than there had been, days of small domestic triumphs and gradual improvements in river health that made neighborhood fishermen more hopeful. The cleanup would take years. The children's lungs likely always bore markers of early exposure. But they also bore new evidence. Stitches, fragile, human, of care. On a mild afternoon years after that first night, the community organized a small ceremony by a cleaned stretch of riverbank. Children with bright orange life jackets giggled and threw small paper boats in a supervised event. A plaque was unveiled recognizing community government corporate partnerships for remediation and health support. Ethan and Lily walked together to the water's edge. She was older now, tall in a way that made her still feel like a child he was responsible for, and at once a peer. She carried Emma, now toddling, on her hip. Ethan placed a hand on the stone plaque and then, almost without thinking, reached out to the river. He let his fingers brush the surface. The water was cool and moving, carrying along a smell that was cleaner than it had been in those early, terrible months. He did not call it victory. He thought rather of steady work and of promises kept in the small way that shapes lives. "Do you remember the night?" Lily asked, looking at him sideways. Her expression was embarrassed and proud in the same breath. Children learn to translate big truths into small ones. "I do," he said. He felt the memory of snow, the fragile chest he had cradled, the fear and the decision. "You told me to save your sister first." "You did," she said. "You stayed." He did not expect gratitude to feel like both balm and a charge. He nodded, and then, in a voice that had been softened by years and parenting and watching a river heal in increments, added, "And you all kept me honest." There are stories whose end is less a tidy bow than a continuous seam. This one did not end redemption, or fix all systems at once. It did not erase the past. It did, however, change trajectories. Ethan's life, less precise, more knotted now with the lives of others, had become committed to repair in ways that cost him. That was the moral elbow of the story. The cost is real, and the work continues. A brief note on the shape of the change. It was not a single sensational gesture, but a series of small, sustained commitments. Ethan had signed off on remediation budgets. He spent nights in the hospital, in the kitchen, in meetings with angry neighbors and patient scientists. He stood in court and said something that sounded like accountability. Then he followed through. He opened his life to the messy work of being a guardian, and his company to the messy work of being responsible for a footprint. And Lily, small, fierce, precise, grew into someone who asked questions publicly and whose life threaded the personal and political together. She learned to name the river as neighbor and as casualty, and to demand both cleaning and care. Rick did not become a saint. He made slow progress in a program designed to keep him accountable, while offering a real pathway to re-engage. Maria read their files and slept poorly sometimes, but stayed the consistent institutional hand that converted emergency into stability. If you have been moved by the way a single plea in the snow unspooled into a long, costly, consequential response, remember that the real shock was not merely the image of a wealthy man holding a baby. The real shock, the part that matters, was the recognition that responsibility, when taken, implies long labor and public risk. The thing that startled people was not the photo, but the sustained follow-through. The man who could have retreated instead stepped into guardianship. He who could have given a check chose instead to remain present, to rework the systems that fed the harm, and to live out a messy ethic of repair. There is no fairy tale ending here, only a lived one. A river that improves incrementally, a company that begins to behave differently under watchful eyes, a child who learns to speak for her neighborhood, an adult who learns to be more than an executive. In the end, the measure of the choice is in months and years, in small acts repeated until they accumulate. If this story has stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who believes that presence matters, who believes that responsibility is worth taking even when it costs. If you want to hear more stories like this, you can like and subscribe. Your attention helps keep these small truths alive. The city in winter had held its breath that night. The river kept moving, unglazed by sentiment. Lives continued, in the glare of monitors and the warmth of kitchens, in public meetings and in quiet gardens. The plea on the sidewalk, the precise smallness of a girl asking, "Please save my sister," did something that publicity never could. It demanded a moral reckoning that could not be outsourced. And across several hard years, it changed a man, a company, and a community enough to make new space for hope, stubborn and ordinary as a blooming marigold.